problem. Okay, so we already obviously had introduced the Rambam. We talked about the fact that he was born in Cordova, southern Spain, Muslim Spain. But when he was 15 years old, his family made the decision to leave because the Almohad invasion had already taken place, and conditions were very bad for the Jews at that point. So he actually goes northward for about 10 years, and he lives in then Christian Spain, but then the family makes the decision to go to Morocco, which actually we discussed last time. That almost seems a little bizarre because that was an Almohad, stronghold. That's where they came from originally. But obviously they didn't bother them, and because I guess it was such a well-known family, so they themselves, even though the bulk of the Jews here had to outwardly convert to Islam, but they could live even outwardly as Jews. But after just a number of years there, then they decided whether they think they're going to go to Israel. Things don't seem to work out there. They're there maybe a year in the city of Akko. And then they decide to go to Egypt, and they settle in Fustat, which is today Cairo. And, all along he has been writing. He's been started his the most famous work, the Moreh, not the Moreh Nevuchim, more his Mishnah Torah. So a lot of his great works will be published literally in Egypt. Right, that's where they're going to be coming from. They don't have any statue of him in Egypt, to my knowledge, but they should take pride. The Spaniards who threw us out, right? They already have a statue for Maimonides. But the interesting thing is, by the way, as Maimonides came to be so well known, again, several sources. I'm not sure where he got his, so to speak, secular education. I don't know what types of schools or did his father arrange for individual instruction for him. I mean, he's known as this great Aristotelian, he certainly was well versed in Aristotle's philosophy, but I don't know exactly where he got this education. And he's actually even in, I don't know, not so much about the Muslim world, but in the Christian world, he's highly respected. It's considered this great philosopher. And I don't know if some of his works or were ever studied within the church. I'm not sure exactly, but I do know that he is highly respected, certainly traditionally, in the medieval period by Christian scholars. Now, the great and very famous work that he produced after the Mishnah Torah. The Mishnah Torah is a work of halacha, and it is arranged by topic. And we talked about the fact that there are 14 volumes. It's also called Yad Chazaka because the word Yad, numerically, the Yud is 10, Dalet is 14, and there are 14 volumes to the Mishnah Torah. And having learned it myself, parts of it, it is written in a beautiful, beautiful Hebrew. You can, if obviously you have some sort of a basic knowledge of Hebrew, you can easily understand it. And not only is it a work of halacha, he also integrated within it some of his philosophical views, some of his theological views. There's even medical advice, tells you how you should eat, rest. It's really quite fascinating. And it, I believe this one was always written in Hebrew. Some of his works were in Arabic and then translated into Hebrew. The Mishnah Torah was written in this beautiful Hebrew. And as it got dispersed into the known Jewish world, it became very popular very fast. Again, because it's so beautifully written. It is, even though there were some other works in the Gaonic period that made an attempt to organize halacha, and again, topically. But I would say after the Gemara, really, literally after the Talmud, this is the greatest work of halacha, And so we're talking about about the year 450 when the Gemara, the Talmud, again, just to remind yourselves, Talmud means Mishnah plus Gemara. That's what it is. And when that was redacted, again, about that year 450 CE, and now we're talking about, into the 1150, 1160. This is not the greatest work that will be universally accepted by Jews wherever they might live. And so obviously it's not only known within what will become to be known the Sephardic world, meaning Spain and all of North Africa, and obviously even the Jews living in the Middle East, but even the Balei Tosfos up in France and Germany, when this work becomes known to them, they're also going to greatly admire it and give it credence. Okay. Now, he actually also then wrote apparently a separate halachic work. It's called Sefer HaMitzvos, which was actually written in Arabic, and in that he lists the 613, Taryag mitzvah. All right, that was a separate work. The Mishnah Torah is a much more substantial, work. He's also known for his great philosophical work, which is called Moreh Nevuchim, Guide to the Perplexed. Okay. It's funny, I'm sure you were exposed to this perhaps as you grew up and went to school, that, it's recommended that one should not study this particular philosophical work till you reach the age of 40. Sasha, I called up my son Yechiel, he's my go-to person, for extra information. I said, well, when did this idea that you couldn't study until you were 40, when did that come into being? He said, actually, now don't forget, this work is being written in the 12th century. It wasn't until the 17th century that Rav is actually named called Shach, although that's also the name of was a great Rav in Eretz Israel, that said that you had to be 40 years old before you had attained the level of confidence in your own Jewish background before you could tackle, right, Moreh Nevuchim. In any case, well, that's where the idea of 40. But you'll see, so those who opposed Rambam during his lifetime, after his lifetime, they actually made the age that you have to be at least 25. All right. But in later years, so centuries later, then it became popular to say, no, not until you were 40 could you be introduced to, because it could potentially lead to dangerous ideas, and then you would start doubting, so many aspects of Yahadus, and you might be then prone to leave the religious way of life. Okay, again, this was written obviously originally in Arabic. But again, how is it going to be spread, especially to the Ashkenazi community? So it was then translated into Hebrew by a man, and I will discuss him at greater length later, by Shmuel ibn Tibbon, who was from Provence. It's interesting, a lot of the popularity of Rambam's works, especially this philosophical work, appealed to the Jews of Provence. I want to do a whole unit just on the Jews of Provence. They were a more worldly group of people. Those Jews, and we're descended from the Jews of Ashkenaz, their focus was more on halachic material. They didn't delve into philosophy at all. But the Jews of Provence, again, perhaps because of their proximity to Spain, where there was a lot of culture going on, a lot of literary output. So they were a more worldly group of people. All right. Again, part of the problem with Moreh Nevuchim, and I have to be honest, I have never studied it, so I don't know if you have. But I guess people studying it, even though Rambam, his goal was to prove the magnificence, the brilliance of Judaism, and he's comparing it to other modes of philosophy then extant, in the world, but he's trying to show how, Yahadus is far superior. But unfortunately, many people took a look at this work and they felt, well, why is he comparing it? And why is he bringing in these other modes of thought, that it could be potentially dangerous, right? I guess, unless one had a very, very firm foundation in Judaism. He wrote this probably, he was 50, 60 years old. I'm not sure 100% how old he was, because I saw different dates, so I have no idea. But he himself was, a more mature man. He talks a lot about the fact you know how when we study Chumash and we talk about God's hand and his arm, and these are anthropomorphic, I can't pronounce the word properly, that God is somehow corporeal, and that he has certain attributes, he's angry, he's jealous, I mean, and that was the only way that man could really comprehend God's attributes. Not that God himself actually has these attributes at all. So, so he wrote in the Moreh Nevuchim, he concentrates on the fact that God is incorporeal, right? You can't touch him, you can't see him, you can't feel him. And this is what is so unique, right, to God. But he talks about his unity. There are different names, as you know, that when we talk about God in Chumash, we'll talk Hashem, Elohim, Kel Shaddai, there's some others, and he has these names, but then it's more man's attitude towards God in a particular juncture at a certain time period, and that's why he's called by these different things. But he is one. There is only the one God. He also talks, apparently in the book, he talks about prophecy. And I do remember learning, the different levels of prophecy, and those are coming from the Rambam and his interpretation of it. And then he talks a lot about, and this is a dilemma for many people. We talk about man's free will, that you have the choice. Will you choose to do good, or will you choose to good evil? But then we also talk about the fact that God has his hashgacha. He's always looking, down on us, and he knows what our actions will be. So there's this dilemma. How can you have free will if God already knows? But I always had learned that, it's almost like a father with his child. You might give your child a choice, what do you want to eat? But the child's predilection, that the child will choose a certain item or even as they mature, a certain path in life. But that doesn't mean you're making that choice. The child is making that choice on his own. And of course, we are God's children. All right. And then he talks about creation. There are apparently a myriad of topics. But again, people saw this sefer and it's brilliant. But again, they were fearful. Should it go into the hands of somebody, again, who's not strongly versed, right, in Yahadus and the Torah and the understanding, of the mitzvot, that it might lead them to veer off the proper path. Okay. Now, this confrontation primarily arose in Provence. Now, remember, I told you the Jews of Provence were very closely aligned with the Jews in Spain. So, the work did travel there. I imagine at some point it did obviously go to the Jews of Ashkenaz, but they weren't so interested in philosophy. So I don't know. You'll see there's this huge conflagration that's going to rise between those who, specifically in Provence, those who backed Rambam, with his mode of thought, and those who opposed him. And we'll learn, again, I want to make that a separate unit. It became really ugly as time went on. Okay. There's one more work that he wrote that he's very well known for, and that's called Igeret Teiman. Remember, we talked about Igeret Shema. That was a way of giving encouragement to those Jews who had felt forced to convert to Islam, but are secretly living their lives as Jews. And he wrote that work to encourage them and to say, you're in very difficult circumstances, and I understand, but really you're good, true Jews. Anyways, so he wrote this other work to the Jews of Yemen. There had been a very difficult time period in Yemen at this juncture. I think he was already living in Egypt when they appealed to him, and they have a terrible persecution that's going on, and then some false messiah, Novi Sheker, arose there, and again they needed chizuk, they needed encouragement. They were doing their very best, and that they shouldn't lose hope. So he wrote this work, Igeret Teiman, which apparently was originally also in Arabic and then eventually was translated into Hebrew. Now, we mentioned that he became a physician while in Egypt. He was not a physician, neither in Spain nor in Morocco, but he did become one while living in Egypt. Again, I don't know where he learned medicine from, okay? I imagine in those days, you would somehow apprentice yourself, perhaps, to a physician. Don't forget, first of all, he is a brilliant man. And he's already been exposed not only to philosophy, but probably to some of the sciences. And it was 20 years, actually, that he was a physician in Egypt before he is given the position of court physician. And I told you the Sultan at that point, the vizier, is Saladin, the one who reconquered Jerusalem from the Christians. In any case, and apparently he wrote some medical treatises that also were written originally in Arabic, and then eventually they will be translated into Hebrew. Now, the year 1193, he would now think about this. He was only appointed court physician in the year 1190. So Saladin's already an older man. He dies in the year 1193. And then there apparently was this bitter war succession. Who's going, which of his sons or perhaps somebody else wanted to usurp the throne. And the Rambam, like nilly-willy, I'm sure he didn't want to get involved. He's born, somehow drawn into this fray. And he ends up backing the oldest son of Saladin. Thank God that person did win out, so the Jewish community, was also saved as a result. But apparently, it took so much out of him, this aggravation, this conflict, that his health began to deteriorate. And by the year 1200, he was mostly bedridden. Apparently, he still continued, his literary output. I'm sure questions came into him and he was sending out answers. But again, he becomes weaker and weaker, and he eventually dies in the year 1204. And just what did I want to tell you here? Apparently, almost the entire community of Fostat, obviously for sure the Jewish community, but even non-Jewish community mourned him. He was this very greatly respected, renowned figure in their country in Egypt at that time. And apparently in the city of Yerushalayim, and there are very few Jews living there, let me tell you, but apparently they actually declare a fast, on his behalf. He's eventually taken to Israel. He's buried in Tiberia. I'm sure many of you, not all of you, have been to the city of Tiberia, and you can see his tomb. Now, I remember going there. My year in Israel was 66, 67. And I remember going to where the Rambam is buried, and I thought, boy, it was a pretty deplorable state of affairs there, and a little grungy, and But you go back now, I don't know at what point they fixed it up, but now it's greatly enhanced, and it's to be a proper kavod for a man of his stature. That they finally have fixed this up, and it's clean. And some of his quotations, whatever, you can see that there if you go to Tiberia. And on his tomb is a quotation. It's very famous. It says, "Mi Moshe LaMoshe lo kom k'Moshe," from Moshe Rabbeinu, right? Until the time of Moshe ben Maimon, Rambam, there has not arisen anybody like Moshe. So obviously, highly, highly thought of within the Jewish world, even though, boy, there'll be tons of controversy, about his works, particularly his philosophical works. Okay. Now, by the way, we all, whether Ashkenazi or Sephardi, we all highly respect him and learn from him. But apparently in the Sephardic world, he's like, has really given a great position of prominence. And the problem, I can understand why the controversy arose because in Spain, there was a great stress in the general community on the study of philosophy. In addition, the Jews are being persecuted and they're being dislocated and having to move from place to place. So there was like a lot of skepticism, unfortunately, arose, within the Jewish communities there. And then the fear, what would happen to these Jews, and would they totally abandon their Judaism? Were they putting like general philosophy, on a higher plane than the study of Yahadus? So this led, to this terrible, terrible conflict. It really went totally just like those riots in Washington. I mean, you'll see, just awful. But certainly down now through the ages. I mean, this is one of the most respected Rabbanim that we have, and his works are greatly honored and respected. We could not admire, a man, of this stature more than we do the Rambam. All right, I think I will conclude that with my study of the Rambam. Now I want to talk to you more about the Jews of Provence, because they're the ones who will be either the greatest adherents of Rambam or the greatest critics of Rambam. And boy, are they going to create a terrible, terrible controversy. First of all, just to show you on the map, where is Provence? So it is southern Spain, close to the Mediterranean Sea. I think maybe this one's a little clearer. You can see where Provence is. And it's very close to Spain. It's very close to the Pyrenees. All right. And then these are I just have some of the towns, so it's, they're a little clearer. Okay. So bear in mind that there's this very close link between the Jews of Provence and the Jews of Spain. It's interesting, even though Provence is France, but they really did not have so much to do with, let's say, the Bale Tosfos in northern France, all right? They are more closely aligned philosophically with the Jews of Spain. Now we talk about Provence. I don't know, I've never been there personally, but I've seen several French films that take place in Provence. It is a beautiful, beautiful country. It's a lot of mountains, in the areas, and lovely valleys, and it's a very lush area. But it also includes the area called Languedoc. And Languedoc is the southernmost part of France, right near the Pyrenees. So, I'm sure perhaps you might have read some books about, when during the time period of the Holocaust, when people from, let's say, northern central France, gradually went to Vichy France, more central southern France, and then eventually that's taken over by the Nazis. And they, some of them were able to escape over the Pyrenees. And again, so they were obviously in that area in Provence, certainly the city of Marseille. And then eventually, obviously smugglers, people had to guide them. And the Pyrenees are very, very high mountain range, and it was very, very difficult to cross there. So, just bear this in mind. Okay. Apparently, in the early days of the Frankish kingdom, so we're talking about Charlemagne, right, and all the descendants, the ones, his father, grandfather before him, and sons who came after him. They were the rulers. At that point, it did cover all of France. And there apparently was a battle. There was a siege in the city of Narbonne. We're talking again Provence. And apparently a Jewish knight saved, again, this is a tradition. So I don't know, like folklore, that a Jewish knight saved the life of Charlemagne. And then he was so grateful, for that. So he rewarded the Jews with special privileges. I mean, I do know for a fact that during Charlemagne's reign, he treated the Jews very favorably. He brought in members of the Colonimus family from Italy. They were great scholars to come and live in France. Things were fine for us during his reign. But eventually, what happened was that we had discussed it when we were talking about the Jews in the more northern part of France. So the king really just ruled over the area called the Ile-de-France, which is Paris and its environs. And gradually, over the centuries, they will consolidate their power over the entire country. But when Provence is developing now as a Jewish center, right, they are not ruled over by the King of France, okay, by all the various Louis, all right? They have their own local counts or kings, and those are the ones who ruled over Provence. So they're not going to be affected as much by what's going on in the Ile-de-France. Apparently in the year 1113, so again, rule is somewhat fragmented in Provence and then obviously Languedoc, and the Count of Barcelona, okay, now we're definitely talking about Spain, right, expanded his rule and he annexed actually Provence. So again, so you can just see the very close ties between the Jews of southern France and the Jews of Spain. And also a lot of Jews, just like Rambam, remember he had to flee with his family, southern Islamic Spain because of the Almohad invasion. And, they're going to go northward into Christian Spain, and then eventually they're going to go into Provence. So gradually, it never became a huge community, but there were some very well-known scholars who eventually find their way to Provence and set up shop there. Okay, and I told you the study of philosophy, the sciences, just as they were key components of the study of a general society. It also affected the Jews of Spain, and then they're going to carry on this tradition into Provence. So again, I would say it was a very I would use the term today, like a very cosmopolitan community. I mean, they weren't in big cities, they were these little towns actually, but I mean it was a very cultured community, and they weren't just studying Jewish law and tradition, as was the case for the Jews of Ashkenaz. They are studying other disciplines, and they at that point they're not seeing that it's dangerous, and if anything, they feel like it's enhancing, I guess, their understanding, of the Torah. I mean, as I was studying and preparing, for this class, well, it's brought down all the way to our modern time. Don't we have this push and pull? What role will secular education have within the Jewish world? How much? How little? Do we have to fear it, or can we welcome it? I mean, just for myself, hopefully for you too, I'm not afraid of learning other things, other ideas. If anything, to me, it just strengthens my own belief, in Yahadus. But I get it became a real problem, how much, and, how well grounded are you in your own basic knowledge that to withstand the introduction? I mean, this happens for, obviously I always send my children to Jewish schools, but, some people, when their kids get older, they allow them to go to just general colleges. And if the kids are not properly equipped, here they're meeting these professors, these very well-educated people, and they're introducing various ideas to them, and they're not equipped to argue back, to understand what a high-level Judaism is. And so it can sway them, unfortunately, to leave the fold. Okay, so I just wanted to give you a picture of what it's like in Provence. And so Spanish Jewry is now coming to towards the end of their golden age, all right? We have those Jews up in the north, right? The Ashkenazi Jews. And then we have this community of Provence. So I want to mention to you some key people. I was actually so surprised for myself personally as I'm learning these people, because I have heard of them, but I did not know that they came from Provence. So one of the earliest ones, and he's already even from the 11th century. 11th century, think of Rashi. Rashi, that's the 1000s. And his name was Rabbi Moshe Hardashan. Does this sound familiar? Okay. And I was trying to remember, well, where would I have encountered him? So I'll tell you, more about him, and then you'll know why he sounds familiar to me. He's actually one of the very earliest of the scholars from Provence who are then known, to later generations. He was a great grandson of this man. His name was Rabbi Abun, and he was the first Rosh Yeshiva in the city of Narbonne. So already a yeshiva has been established. Obviously, we're talking about a while. So I mean, he's the great grandson, but he becomes a scholar in his own right, and then eventually he himself will be head of the yeshiva. Now he wrote an anthology of midrashim, and it's ranged according to the various pesukim, in the Torah, and then he has some of his own insights and allusions to different things, and gematria. You like gematria, and he was well known though about among the scholars in Ashkenaz, and in fact, this is now how I know of him. Rashi quotes him. So should you ever be studying Chumash, and you ever look down and you want to see what one of the Meforshim, what Rashi might have said to interpret it, you'll see he will quote from Rabbi. And remember, Rashi likes midrashim, so you could see wow, this man's work appealed to him. And
what's his name, Malka?
Rabbi Moshe Hadarshan. Drash, he's drash. He's he's looking to interpret the words more clearly. That's where the word medrash comes from. That. Okay, that's all I know about him. But I remember as I'm coming across him, I say, boy, this man sounds familiar. Where would I have ever heard that he'd be quoted? And then, I guess from all the years when I did study Rashi with Chumash, that's how I know him. Okay, now it's ironic because you're going to be amazed at how many famous Rabbonim came out of Provence, but they were not a large Jewish community at all. And they lived in all these little towns spread out all over Provence. They lived, I'll just mention some of the names, Narbonne, we just did, Montpellier, we're going to hear about that a lot more later, Lunel, Pasquier, Perpignan, and Marseille. Good thing I took French. I do not know how to pronounce these names. And once before, I had talked about Benjamin of Tudela. He was a Spanish Jew who went wandering around. He had made enough money, and now he wanted to explore, other regions of the known world. And he traveled all these different Jewish communities, and then he wrote about them. So that's how we have a lot of information about even the Jews from the Middle Eastern area and around even the Balkans because of him. And he did this in the 12th century, and apparently. He was in Provence in the year 1165, now already our mid-12th century. And he himself comments that even though these communities are really very small, and they're spread out in the mountains there, that they had this amazing number of Jewish yeshivot schools and great scholars. So I guess they turned inwardly and devoted themselves to their studies, and they're very well known. There were two great yeshivot at this time period, and one is in the city of Narbonne, who we already mentioned, and in the city of Lunel. Apparently, they were known for their depth of knowledge, their excellence in Torah, and their way of thinking came where they were influenced very much by the tradition of the Gaonim of Bavel. Obviously, Jews throughout the world were influenced by the Gaonim, but I guess they particularly looked to their writings for guidance, when they did their own learning and then their own writing. And they were apparently very fierce in their defense of this. Maybe living in the mountains, you become fierce. I'm not sure, but you'll see. Boy, they were quite a crew, and they then were exposed to it and wrote commentaries on that of the Rif, by Alfasi. There's one from Fez, who then went to Spain. The Ballet Tosfos, obviously that's northern France, and the Rambam's works. All right, and I had mentioned this before. As the Rambam's various works, came to be published and then translated, it became known also, obviously, to all these scholars in Provence, and and they heard what a great man Rambam is. He's brilliant, and so they studied his works. However, there was one group that loved Rambam, and thought Everything he wrote was just brilliant. And then there were others who really opposed him, and they were not quite in how they said this. All right. One of the scholars, and I'm not as familiar with him, but I saw quite a bit written about him, so I guess he is considered to be prominent. He's called the Razah. His name is Rabbi Zerachia Halevi of Lunel. And apparently he originally came from the city of Girona. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. That's north of Barcelona. Later on, when we learned about the Ramban, he also came from there, because I know my son Shalom traveled there. But he came then eventually he obviously left Spain, and he came to live in Provence, and he came there already even as a child. He wrote a very critical work of the halachos of the Rif, who was considered this giant of Torah, and it's called the Sefer HaMaor, this enlightened work. All right, he wrote this when he was only 19 years old, and throughout he's being highly critical of the Rif and his writings, but he's constantly phrasing it in such a way, he's sorry, he understands how great the Rif is, but he disagrees with him. Then he lists, all his various points. The work is called Sefer HaMaor, which is light, because it's a allusion to his name, Zerach, which means to shine, right? And also the name of his city, Lunel, which comes from the French word luna, which is the moon. And he also got into arguments with another scholar who I have heard of. We'll do him in a little bit. That's the Ravid, all right? Also a Provence Jew. But even though as I say, apparently he wrote some pretty harsh words, and later was criticized by other scholars, for how, he kept on finding fault in the Rif's writings, whereas I told you he's considered to be one of our giants of Torah. But again, he does it in a respectful manner, unlike you'll see how some people treat the Rambam. Okay, so now I want to talk to you more about the Ravid, and I have heard of the Ravid. Now, apparently there's a Ravid the 1, right, Roman numeral 1, Ravid the 2, and Ravid the 3rd. And again, I asked my son, Yechiel, to be sure. He is the famous one, this Ravid the 3rd. So we're not going to talk about the other 2 men who had, that designation. His real name is Rabbi Avraham ben David, and he lived from 1120 to 1186. Apparently, he was also one of these brilliant young men, and he became, a great Rav in the city of Lunel. And then he went for a while to a yeshiva in the city of Nimes, that's Nimes, Nîmes. But then he goes to Poitiers. So he's a Ravid of Poitiers. That's the city where he established his own yeshiva. Apparently he came from a very wealthy family, but he lived, a rather ascetic existence. He was a very holy man, and he used his money. I guess he inherited the money. He wasn't obviously making it himself. It was, a Rav, head of a yeshiva. But he used this to help support his yeshiva and any impoverished students, who came to learn there. Now, he was, again, a very strong person. And there's something about Provence that gave rise to these people with very, very strong personalities. And they were not shy about, versing their opinions on different things. But again, he was this brilliant man. He's his works, are very well accepted, and he's considered to be the leader, for this generation, for the 12th century, of the scholars of Provence. By the way, they're also known as Chachmei Provence, the wise men of Provence. Now he kept on a running dispute and commentary with this Razah, that's like Rabbi Zerachia, the one I mentioned right before, all right? And discussing different halachic matters and communal matters, how to handle different things. And the Ravid criticizes Razah. Well, don't forget, remember, originally he does come from Spain. He said, you don't really know the Provençal way of learning. This is one of his main criticisms of him. And boy, does he get into a big dispute with the Rambam, dumping on him, disagreeing, with his writings, even things within the Mishnah Torah that he did not like at all. One thing, actually, Rambam agreed with him. He one of his criticisms of the Mishnah Torah was that, and I believe when I had discussed the Mishnah Torah last time, Rambam doesn't list his sources. Where did he get the defining decisions as to what the halacha? And remember, the Gemara is just discussions. I mean, you could read that and come away from it thinking, huh? So what do we do? I mean, as I'm reading it myself now with Daf Yomi, it's like, well, I know how we do things, but at what point, was the decision made? So he apparently wrote to Rambam, on his high horse, what's this? And you say, this is why, is this a halacha? Where's your sword? Where's the proof? So Rambam actually wrote him back and said, you're right. and his intention was at some point, he just never got around to it, just to show where his sources actually came from. I thought this was very interesting about the Ravid. That he wrote a work on the laws of family purity, Taras Mishpacha, and apparently he has within this work many lists various laws for actually constructing a mikveh. So I don't know. I guess even to this day, perhaps people look at this book. I'm not familiar with it. Okay. And apparently and then apparently when the Shulchan Aruch will be compiled, right? That great work, I guess, is dependent on, certainly for these things with Taras Mishpacha. So a lot of that groundwork was in this work of the Ravid, and then later on, it's included in the Shulchan Aruch. But we're talking about, the 1500s, much time after. Now, this man, for sure, and I think all of you perhaps might have heard of him, one of the most famous Rabbanim from this time period is the Radak. And his name is Rabbi David Kimchi, and he lived from 1160 to the year 1235. Actually, I just have to tell you, here in Boca, in my community, there's a young man, and that's his name. So whenever I see him, I think, oh, are you Radak? But his name is Rabbi David Kimchi. So he said somehow in his lineage, right, he is related. He apparently was only 10 years old when his father died, and he was actually then raised by an older brother of his. And he wrote a beautiful commentary to Tanakh. We don't have all the volumes on which he wrote, but I know myself, I'm doing Malachim Aleph now, I'm teaching that, and a lot of quotations, are from Radak and his opinion, on how to interpret what's going on. So the only ones we have from Radak that have come down through the ages. So apparently he wrote on Bereshis, but not he might have written on the other books, but the only one that's come down is the one on Bereshis. So we have that one, and obviously all of the Nevi'im, and also Tehillim, Mishlei, and Divrei Hayomim. So it comes in very handy, again, when you're learning the Nevi'im, especially I'm doing Malachim Aleph, because I look a lot to compare and contrast with Chronicles, that's Divrei Hayomim. He stresses the plain meaning of the text, that's the Peshat. First you have to have a good understanding, what's going on. Then he might add in some midrashim, to help illustrate something, but stress on the Peshat. And he's also was very keen on the grammar and his historical data. This is so I like his interpretations very much. And he sometimes will have some philosophical interpretations as well. It varies. He apparently also was vehemently opposed to Christianity, and he wrote some works against that religion. And one of them is called Teshuvot HaNotzrim, the word Notzrim, that means Christians, answers to the Christians, and Vikuach, which means like conflict, and they're eventually censored, you can imagine, especially as this part of the world is going to be ruled over by Christians. I have to tell you, my Zeta used to collect very, very old volumes, going back hundreds and hundreds of years. I remember my brother has these books now. There were several books there that you could see a censor had gone through them and like blacked them out, or they burned them. I think literally someone would burn a particular word because they felt it was making a reference to Christianity in very negative terms. So whatever, that's what they did to it. He also, there's a very famous phrase, again, actually I had Joel help me find this one, because the word kimchi, the word kemach, flour. So there's a very famous pasuk from Pirkei Avos, And it says, Im ein kemach, ein Torah. If you don't have flour, in other words, if you don't have some sort of sustenance, you can't engage in Torah. And then vice versa, it also says, ein Torah, ein kemach. It's a symbiotic relationship, and we can't survive really one without the other. He also wrote a book on Hebrew grammar and also a dictionary of scriptural terms. This is so interesting. Apparently, that particular work was later used by non-Jewish scholars, Christian scholars who wanted to learn Hebrew. And in fact, actually, a very famous French, I can't remember what his position was, but Richelieu apparently studied this. So I have to look up Richelieu, but I do remember at some point when I studied, world history, I do remember hearing his name. Let's see. Now, Radak does come to the defense of Rambam, as opposed to those other guys who did not like him at all. Okay, Radak does, but the time he comes to his defense, he's already an older man, and but at least he voices his opinion, and he was one of the most highly respected Rabbonim of the Jews of Provence. So let me see. So we're already getting almost 10 up. The next person, well, I'll just do one more person. So we have him. He's a great translator. He's the great translator of the Rambam's works from Arabic into Hebrew, and he came from a family of translators, and his name is Shmuel Ibn Tibbon. Have you ever heard of his name? His father, he translated and you can see that they had an interest in philosophy because that's what they translated. So his father, again, this is the Shmuel. The father's name was Yehuda. And so he translated Ibn Bach's Chovot HaLevavot, Duties of the Heart. He also translated Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's Kuzari. These are all philosophical works. And also Rabbi Saja Gaon's, or that's the Gaonic period, Emunot V'Deot. All right. So he obviously has inherited the same interest, and he becomes known again as a very excellent translator. He also was born in the city of Lunel, then he moved to Marseille. And apparently some of the terms he uses were later adopted by later scholars, and he had Hebraized, these terms, and then they came down through the ages. But he's most famous because he's the one who translated Moreh Nevuchim, Rambam's great philosophical work, from Arabic into Hebrew. So the fact that it could be easily read is because he chose such beautiful Hebrew words. Apparently, there have been other people who have translated Rambam's work, but his is considered to be like the best, and it's like the accepted version, that one should look to. Apparently, he also translated the Mishnah Torah was already in Hebrew. He also translated Rambam. Remember, originally one of his earliest works was a commentary on the Mishnah, so he translated that also from Arabic to Hebrew. And that last work of Rambam's, the Igeret Teiman, as a response to the Jews of Teiman and when they were living under difficult time periods, he also translates that one into Hebrew. And in fact, Rambam was most appreciative and wrote him letters thanking him. And apparently, that he was a great himself a philosopher, and that he himself then traveled throughout Provence, northern Spain, and even went apparently to Egypt. So I think I better stop here, okay, because we're running, out of time. We will continue. I mean, you will be amazed at the additional famous Rabbanim who come out of Provence, and then we'll start talking a bit more about that huge, argument that arose against the works of the Rambam. So all should be well. May things turn peaceful here in our country. May God bless the United States of America, as we say.
Amen.
Amen. We certainly need Hashem there to help us. Anyway.